Chapter 11. The Translation. Melinda waited in a pew while Lindy stepped into the confessional with much to confess, but nothing she would. Father O'Donovan, we have the writing that we'd like you to translate. Do you have time now? Lindy, while you're here, maybe you should. I don't have the time now. Maybe later. Do you promise? I'll try. Father O'Donovan and Lindy stepped out of the confessional and sat in a nearby pew. Let me see what you've got, he said. Lindy handed him a paper copy of the message and explained that it was incomplete. For several minutes, he read and thought about it. Then a puzzled expression covered his face. He rose, turned, and walked away. Father, where are you going? I'll be back in a minute. I need to check something. What? He didn't answer. Martin sat next to Melinda. For 10 minutes, they sat and did nothing. Finally, Melinda said, maybe we should go look for him. Don't worry. At the rate he's moving these days, he couldn't have gone far, Martin quipped. My body may be slow, but I get where I'm going fast enough for the Lord, Father O'Donovan said with a smile. Sorry, Father, Lindy said. Not to worry. I thought I had heard those Latin words just recently. The first part translates vaguely to, as he did without children. The second part is something like, so no children will be among. Of course, it's hard to make sense of that without the missing words. Then I remembered something from a week or two ago. After a demonstration at a family clinic in which there was some violence, to which I objected, I invited the demonstrators on both sides to come in for a discussion. I gave flyers to the parishes and the 2 protest groups to post, and then some handouts to circulate. We met in the basement of the church. Things were pretty heated, but not too bad. Then one of the pro-choice people wanted to know where in the Bible it specifically says that abortion is wrong. Before I could tell them, a hooded man in the back of the room shouted, 1 Samuel 15 verse 33, and then he quickly recited the passage, in Latin. I was impressed, and was going to ask him to translate it, but he stood and walked out. Do you remember what he looked like? No. He was wearing a hoodie, so I never got a good look at him. Martin asked, Okay, what is 1 Samuel 15 verse 33? Father O'Donovan read what he had written on the copy Lindy had given him. Et 8 Samuel sicit facit absci liberis muliers gladius tus sic absci liberis erit inter muliers mater tuati in frusta concidit Samuel agag coram domino in Galgalis. Melinda remarked, Oh that. Sure. I should have known. Father O'Donovan smiled and chuckled. The Latin is from the Biblia Sacra Vulgata, the Vulgate Bible. It's an old Catholic version of the Bible. Translated, it means, and Samuel said, As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed him in pieces before the Lord in Galgal. Whoever wrote this took only a portion of it. Sicit facit absci liberis muliers gladius tus, sic absci liberis erit inter muliers mater tua. So, what you then have is, As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. So, if the sword is like cutting out the baby, abortion, then whoever has the abortion will be childless. That's kind of obvious, Melinda said. Martin objected. I don't think that's what the killer meant. The woman he killed probably had an abortion, and he then was going to make the woman unable to bear children. That's why he removed the parts associated with having children. He sews up the vagina. He removes the nipples, and he removes the reproductive organs and uterus, each associated with birth. But why does he feed them to her? Melinda asked. He what? Father O'Donovan's hands began to shake. Melinda continued. We found pieces of the uterus and fallopian tube in the stomach contents. We also think that she choked to death when a fallopian tube and ovaries were stuffed down her throat. A shock ran up Father O'Donovan's spine. He trembled, staggered, grabbed the back of the pew, and collapsed. He fell between the pews, curled into a fetal position, and lost consciousness. Father O'Donovan! Martin exclaimed and rushed over to him. Melinda quickly moved around the end of the pew. Get out of the way. Melinda grabbed Martin's arm and pulled, staggering Martin out of the pews. Melinda felt for a pulse. His pulse is rapid and weak. We need to get him out from between the pews. Melinda turned him onto his back. Take his feet and pull. What? I said take his feet and pull. I'll protect his head. When he was away from the pews, Martin and Melinda knelt next to Father O'Donovan. Martin stared at him, hoping that he would open his eyes and make her worry vanish. Melinda checked vital signs again. His breathing is very shallow. Call 911. Shouldn't you do CPR? Lindy asked. No. He's got a pulse and he's breathing. I'll just keep monitoring his vital signs. He's very old, and I don't want to do anything unless I absolutely have to. Martin called and then began to pace. Melinda could see that Martin was in distress, and if O'Donovan took a turn for the worse, she could be a hindrance if she were around. Lindy, get out front and wait for the paramedics. Martin hurried out of the church. Father O'Donovan's head moved just after Martin left. His eyes opened. His eyelids fluttered. He started to gag. She rolled him on his side and held his head. He vomited and passed out again. The paramedics arrived in 10 minutes, and Father O'Donovan was on his way to the hospital in another 5. Martin and Melinda stood next to each other as they watched the ambulance leave. Melinda glanced at Martin, whose vacant stare into the distance announced that she had lost contact with the moment. Melinda touched her arm. I'm really sorry, Lindy. I should never have described her death to him. Martin didn't move. Melinda shook Martin's arm. Lindy, what? I said I'm really sorry, Lindy. I think my description of her death might have caused this. Don't worry. I didn't expect him to react that way either. I'm going to the hospital and make sure he's okay. I'll tell his secretary or one of the nuns what happened. Melinda replied, I'll be waiting out in the car. As Martin and Melinda pulled into the hospital emergency parking lot, the gurney was just rolling through the doors. For 15 nervous minutes, Martin and Melinda waited. Melinda sat, and Martin paced, stopped, looked back into the emergency area, and then resumed pacing. She did this continually, and Melinda marveled at the tenacity of her impatience. When Martin could take it no longer, she barged through the doors and into the room where O'Donovan was being treated. She expected to see people frantically rushing around, but there was only calm and very little movement. O'Donovan was receiving oxygen and intravenous fluids. He was hooked up to monitoring equipment that beeped quietly and regularly. You can't be in here, the nurse said. Lindy showed her badge. I'm the one who called 911. He's a friend, my priest. I understand, but you still can't be in here. Just tell me how he's doing. We think he just fainted, but we're going to give him a thorough checkup to make sure. I don't believe there's anything to worry about. He appears to be very stable now. We want him to rest. Lindy closed her eyes and took a deep breath. As she exhaled, her shoulders sagged with relief. She nearly reached out to hug the nurse, but restrained herself, as she felt she must, from overt emotion. She replaced the gesture with a warm smile. Thank God. Can I check back later? Of course. Just check to see when the visiting hours are. As Martin turned, she saw Melinda standing just inside the emergency room holding the door. Martin gave her a broad smile. Melinda gave one back and moved toward her and hugged her. Martin started to raise her arms to embrace her, but let them awkwardly drop to her side. Melinda felt Martin's reticence and released her from her embrace, and, thus, the emotion. Having had her emotions on edge for several weeks, the sentimental act was simply more powerful than Martin could endure for even a short period. Too much? Melinda asked. With a pretense of puzzlement covering her face, she looked at Melinda and responded, What's too much? Nothing. Forget I said anything. Melinda knew that Martin understood, but a hug meant emotion, and emotion meant vulnerability, and Melinda knew that after the Parker affair had torn through Martin, she would never let any attachment weaken her again. Martin blanked her face and said, Let's get back. We've got some work to do on this lead. It might be the break we need. As Melinda drove, Lindy called Joanne and told her to call an emergency meeting of the task force. Chapter 12. 1 Samuel 15 verse 33. With the task force unexpectedly flooding into the department in the early afternoon, Captain Johnson became more than a little curious. He walked into the briefing room. Detective Martin was not there. He looked at Bryant, who shrugged. I don't know what's up. Martin called an emergency meeting. The captain headed to Detective Martin's office. He gave a brief rap on the door and entered. In large letters, Joanne was frantically writing on a 2-foot-tall paper banner. What the hell is sick it fake it abs? And the rest of that? Sounds like an intestinal infection in Spanish, the captain said. Detective Martin turned. No, that's only part of it. It's Latin, and it's our first real lead. The whole thing is sic it fake it absci liberis muliers gladius tuus, sic absci liberis erit inter muliers mater tua. Great. That clears up everything. We're looking for someone who speaks a language that has been dead for more than 1,000 years. Not necessarily. The quote is from 1 Samuel 15 verse 33 of the Catholic Vulgate Bible. You're not saying the killer is a Catholic priest, are you? It might be, or just a Catholic, or neither. The person just has to know that there is a Latin version of the Bible. But it's the meaning that is intriguing. They had to know what the meaning is because it links directly to the crime. Anyway, the task force is waiting, and I've got to get to the meeting. Join us. I'll go over it there. Sorry, can't do it. I've got a meeting with my boss in 3 minutes, and he hates it when anyone's late. Just leave your report on my desk. We'll talk later. Detective Martin was riding a high and looking forward to presenting the new find. This was the first time she had felt this good since Parker had told her that he had taken a position with the FBI. She was certain that this would mark a new beginning for her. This success would take away the sting. It took Joanne another 10 minutes to finish the Latin and English versions. Detective Martin heard the raucous laughter by the time she was 10 feet out of her office. Then she heard her name in conjunction with Parker's several times, but whatever was said about them was drowned out by a cacophony of voices. It infuriated her to think that she would always be associated with the man who left her, and that her career would always be measured comparing to his success. She was in that turbulent frame of mind when she entered the briefing. Sit down and get quiet. We have work to do. I want you to stop whatever you are investigating and concentrate on the following. The room murmured, mumbled, exchanged glances, and frowned their objection. However, after the detective right purge, there had been no verbalized objections, not even any discussions, at least none that didn't support her theories. Detective Martin motioned to Joanne, who unrolled the first banner. Sic it fake it absci liberis muliers gladius tuus, sic absci liberis erit inter muliers mater tua, and taped it on the wall above the top of the whiteboard. Questioning looks filled the room, but no questions were asked. Detective Martin stepped in front of the banner. Melinda found a small rolled-up piece of cloth in the woman's vagina. That is what it said. She stood to the side and pointed to the banner. Father O'Donovan, a Catholic priest from a nearby parish, said that it's a quote taken from the Catholic Vulgate Bible, which is written in Latin. She nodded to Joanne, who put the second banner under the first. When translated, it means, "As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women." Coupling the quote with the way the murder was committed and where the body was dumped, we're looking at someone who is making a pro-life statement. That's something we knew from the beginning, but now this person has to have known about the Vulgate Bible. And my bet is that no one here even knew that there was an official Latin Bible called the Biblia Sacra Vulgata, or, as it's commonly called, the Vulgate Bible. The killer would also have to know about 1 Samuel 15 verse 33. So this person has to have a strong familiarity with that Bible. That will narrow our search. An anonymous question came from the back of the room. Why not just write it in English? From the side of the room came an answer. It sounds more sinister in Latin, like the Da Vinci Code. And Detective Martin shouted to get their attention. We have a suspect. Father O'Donovan had a meeting with both sides after a demonstration a few weeks ago. One of the people attending the meeting shouted, 1 Samuel 15. 33 foot, and then he said the quote in Latin. So, now we're looking for someone who was at that meeting. Most likely someone at that meeting knows the man. We need to talk to everyone who was at that meeting. We know that people from the two protest groups were there. Martin's plan was simple. They were going to get a list of the people at the meeting from the leaders of the two groups, and then they were going to question every one of them and ask each of them if they know who shouted 1 Samuel 15 verse 33. As Detective Martin left the task force behind, she could feel Parker fading into the distance behind her. She allowed herself a surreptitious smile. Soon her life would be hers, and only hers again. Chapter 13. The Greatest Sin. As usual, Father O'Donovan spent confession time in near solitude. By 4 o'clock, only an elderly lady had shown up with nothing much to confess other than thinking ill of her neighbor for 3 weeks of cleaning up after the neighbor's giant Doberman. The neighbors named him Big Hooper. The lady called him Big Pooper. It's not that no one needed to confess. There was plenty of sin, just not plenty who would admit it, not even to a man behind a screen in a booth who was bound by canon to give absolution and tell no one of the sin. On the surface, that sounds like a pretty good deal, but for many Catholics, it just wasn't enough. Some acted as though God wouldn't get wind of the sin if they kept it to themselves. Father O'Donovan checked his watch. He had waited an extra 10 minutes for any late confessors who just had to unload baggage. He had been doing that for 17 years, and during that time he had precisely 15 sinners with after 4 o'clock confessions, and he had to fight to stay awake with all of them. Their sins just weren't very entertaining. For Father O'Donovan, the upside to being in the confessional was the extended time for reading, almost always the English version of the Catholic Bible. However, he was inspired by the visit of Detective Martin to pull out the old Biblia Sacra Vulgata and the Douay-Rheims translation. He felt like a scholar again. To delve into the nuance of Scripture gave him a sense that he was renewing his faith. He closed the Vulgate Bible. He closed the Douay-Rheims and placed it on top. He opened the door and saw a man wearing a tightly pulled, dark blue hoodie and a pair of large sunglasses. The man raised his hand in a stop gesture and then transformed it into an index finger pointing at the confessional. He said nothing as Father O'Donovan re-entered the booth and placed the books on the bench. Father O'Donovan had long since stopped kneeling during confession for fear that he would not last through the confession or, worse yet, have to call for assistance to rise afterwards. He sat on the bench and slid the cover that obscured the lattice barrier between them. A faint odor of burnt wick and melting candle wax drifted in. I see that you have already lit a candle for someone. Yes, Father O'Donovan. She was in need of cleansing. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, I ask that you hear her confession as she told it to me. This is the time for your confession. I am confessing on behalf of another who has committed God's greatest sin, taking the life of another, the life of an unborn child. She has asked for forgiveness. Then she should confess and ask for forgiveness. She cannot, Father, but she will never commit another sin. Sic et fecit absci liberis muliers gladius tuus, sic absci liberis erit inter muliers mater tua. After the first few Latin words, Father O'Donovan's hands began to shake. With each successive word, the trembling spread through his body. Then the numbness grew. He could feel the blood pulsing in his head. He couldn't focus. He felt the horror of what this man had done, and it was unbearable. He felt himself drifting away. The man spoke sternly and loudly. Father, you must hear her confession and acknowledge God's retribution. It is your duty, just as it was mine, to carry out God's will. Agonized and afraid, Father O'Donovan demanded, What have you done? Ego interfessorinum. In nomine Domini. The confessor's Latin again was imprecise, but it was clear. He had killed in the name of the Lord. The depths of O'Donovan's grief spilled out in a single word. No, Father, those who take the life of the unborn must face God's wrath. The evil had to be purged. God's gift to give life has been cut out and has become the instrument of her death. That is not God's will. That is the desecration of his will. Through the window of the confessional, a hollow voice boomed. I am his will, his wrath, and his retribution. The partition of the confessional shook. The latch on the door rattled. O'Donovan's head swung to it. The walls creaked and then moaned. Ages of dust drifted down, suspended momentarily around his head, and then swirled slowly. The shutter of the confessional window slammed closed. His head swung to the window. The shutter sprang open, blowing away the dust. The booth vibrated, shook, and then swayed. He grabbed the bench. The Bibles fell, and as they hit the floor, a low growling force proclaimed, I am that I am. A second later there was silence and stillness. Father O'Donovan froze. Sternly, the voice whispered, Father, give her absolution. Father O'Donovan had never felt the depths of fear that were now rising in him. His heart pounded the fear to the surface. He trembled. His bowels emptied. "Father, now," the man commanded. Stuttering, Father O'Donovan meekly cried, "She is absolved of her sins." His body bent. He collapsed to the floor and fell into a despair that he had never known existed. The confessional window shut hard and startled him. He heard the other door open and then clatter loudly. He was alone with the sin of another and his guilt. He sat curled on the floor for 20 minutes. Then he rose and, leaving a trail behind him, went to the bathroom to clean up as best as he could. Then he went to his quarters and showered. He wept as the water poured over him. He knew that he would never feel clean again, nor feel the blessings of life as he had felt them before. The evil that had entered the confessional had shaken his belief in humankind and himself. The sanctity of the confession had been adulterated. It would never feel the same. Father O'Donovan sat at his desk for hours considering his obligation to the sanctity of the confessional and the horror that the man may torture and kill again. He didn't know who the man was. So, was telling the police breaking the vow? Was this evil man deserving of the vow? How would he feel if the man committed another horror again? Was this the man who spoke up at the meeting following the demonstration? The hood had hidden his face. It was almost surely the same man. So, was divulging his presence at the meeting wrong? Did the confessional vow follow man? Being at the meeting was not part of the confessional's vow of silence. He reasoned and rationalized. That might be the way out. Ultimately, reasons or rationalizations didn't make the decision. The guilt of violating his vow of silence weighed less than his guilt for saying nothing and allowing the killer to commit another hideous murder. He picked up the phone to call Detective Martin. He hesitated. He didn't have her cell phone number. He phoned her office. It went to voicemail. He left a message. He called the department. She was out of her office. The receptionist asked if he would like to speak to someone else. He only wanted to talk to Detective Martin. He asked for her cell number. The receptionist refused, but asked if he wanted to leave a message for her. He already had. He hung up, and then he waited at his desk with his doubts and his dilemma still haunting him. He hoped that Detective Martin would call soon.